Welcome to episode 50 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. But before we get started, 50 is a big thing for you and I, my friend. This marks our first anniversary. It seems like we've been doing these a lot longer than that, huh?
Maybe a little bit.
Just a little bit, but one year down and hopefully many more years to come. So let's jump into my first topic. This week, Qualcomm and Vodafone announced an OpenRAN set of blueprints intended to provide diversification for the supply chain and vendor community. So what's the real impact of all this? So to go a little bit deeper into the announcement, and this broke today, and I was actually on an analyst pre-briefing right when the press release was issued. But there are 2 reference designs that are being issued. There's one around massive MIMO radio unit platforms, and the second around distributed unit platforms. Now, these won't be available until into the first half of 2022. But I think they're significant. You know, you've got an operator partnering with an infrastructure provider. That's pretty strategic. And one of the couple of the challenges that I see with OpenRAN, number one, it's the complexity, and it's integrating a new set of ecosystem partners into the fold, and so with reference designs and blueprints, that should help simplify and more quickly onboard these different ecosystem players. So that's a positive thing. And from my perspective, given what Qualcomm has been doing, for example, to improve the propagation of mmWave and that sort of thing. The other challenge with OpenRAN is that it's not optimized for performance. It's really optimized around CapEx and OpEx. And so I expect out of this relationship, and it should develop over time, that there should be some goodness from a performance enhancement perspective. So any insights on your part, Anshel?
Yeah, I was actually part of that call as well. So I got the deep dive on it. And what I found was interesting was, and this was something that I also agree with, is how much of a footprint can OpenRAN have with already deployed 5G operators?
We've talked about that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to be a big challenge, but I believe that there are going to still be lots of opportunities for upgrades and mid-band that hasn't been deployed yet. So obviously it's a huge opportunity in the US. And I also think it's going to be a huge opportunity in markets where they're not rolling out very aggressively or they can't afford to.
Yeah.
So I think 5G rollouts might take a little bit more time than I think some people would expect. But I think people are also underestimating the amount of new equipment and new infrastructure needs to be in place for it to work properly and to be a standalone 5G network. So I think there's going to be a longer tail on this than I think a lot of people are expecting. But in the end, it will result in a much more robust, faster, more capable network than what we have today.
I agree. And, there are greenfield deployments going on with Dish in the US, Rakuten in Japan is sort of the poster child for all of this, and Reliance in India. And so definitely, I see the applicability there. I did catch some news this week as well. Telecom Italia is claiming that they're the first to deploy OpenRAN within Europe. And certainly that's well ahead of this relationship with, between Vodafone and Qualcomm. But yeah, we've talked about that before. Most networks are already sort of in the throes of deployment. So OpenRAN, will probably, will definitely be, involved in proof of concepts and those sort of things. Definitely employed in greenfield applications and deployments, but time will tell. But I think this is a step in the right direction. It really addresses, again, 2 of my biggest concerns with OpenRAN, just around the integration complexity and then the performance angle. But we'll both keep our eyes and ears open here and report back as things develop. Let's move into your first topic this week, and you want to talk about OpenSignal mmWave coverage findings.
Yeah, so what's interesting about the OpenSignal report was that they specifically went out and tested the average download speed on millimeter wave by US carrier, and they also were testing average time connected to millimeter wave 5G in the US by carrier as well. And they found that both AT&T and T-Mobile had speeds in the 2 to 300 megabits per second speed range, which is not great for millimeter wave, and that Verizon had about 692. So Verizon's speed in their millimeter wave coverage is much better than AT&T and T-Mobile's, which I believe because Verizon's millimeter wave coverage and the bandwidth you get within their coverage is fairly decent. From my personal testing with multiple millimeter wave devices, I found that you can actually get 1 to 2 gigabits per second pretty reliably as long as you're within coverage. And really, I think Verizon's model of dropping you off millimeter wave if the signal is not good may be a good reason why their speeds are so much better than AT&T and T-Mobile's. AT&T and T-Mobile were also tied for an average time connected to millimeter wave at 0.5%, while Verizon almost doubled that at 0.8%, which is still less than 1%, and is kind of in line with the kind of coverage that Verizon has been saying that they do have with millimeter wave. But I think this report sparked a lot of unnecessary attacks on millimeter wave, primarily because I don't think people really understand why millimeter wave exists or what its use cases are. And I think this is a big problem for the industry, especially the Qualcomms of the world, because they are a big proponent of millimeter wave. And if they can't convince the market that it matters, then OEMs are going to start dropping millimeter wave out of their phones, which I think impacts Qualcomm quite a bit. But ultimately, I believe millimeter wave does have a place, and that it will be really beneficial, especially as the world starts to go back to normal and you start having full stadiums, concert venues, parks, and anywhere where you have people congregate in any kind of meaningful density. Even when you're not in that area, when an event might be happening, just because that event is happening nearby, it can really put a lot of load on the cell network in ways that would be preventable with millimeter wave.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this before as well, and we've talked about Verizon. I wonder if Verizon's recent investments in mobile edge computing is enhancing the performance of their network. Time will tell, and I think we're doing a good job, at least on our podcast with our viewership, trying to educate about millimeter wave. We've talked about some of the conspiracy theories around the health concerns with 5G. Certainly millimeter wave is new with 5G. We haven't had, that high band spectrum in an LTE world. And so it's just, the education needs to occur there. And, I think Qualcomm is doing a good job, and certainly not only, you and I, but we have some other fellow analysts that also conduct 5G oriented podcasts that are trying to educate people around that as well. But it is a critical linchpin. It's part of an overall plan to provide that blend of coverage and performance. So again, we'll just continue beating the drum there and doing our best to educate folks. But let's move to my second topic this week, and actually it's mobile edge computing is a great segue into it. T-Mobile and Lumen Technologies announced an edge infrastructure partnership. And you might argue that T-Mobile's a little bit late to the party with edge. Certainly Verizon, we were just talking about Verizon, they've been out in front, they've been investing heavily in that, and that makes sense given their focus on their millimeter wave deployment. And AT&T has been focused on it as well with relationships with cloud providers and those sorts of folks. What I find interesting about T-Mobile picking Lumen is their fiber footprint. And I'm just going to read some stats here. Lumen has almost 500,000 global route miles of fiber, and almost 200,000 of those are connected, to buildings which are connected to, over 2,000 third-party data centers. And they're working with, all the big guys like AWS, Azure and Google Cloud Platform. And so I sort of view this as it's a necessary step for T-Mobile. They recognize as they build out their enterprise portfolio that edge, putting compute resources closer to the area of data creation is going to supercharge, their 5G capabilities, and really support, use cases like, autonomy in factories and that sort of thing. So I felt like it was a necessary step. I think also it sort of addresses, the fiber element for them, because when you talk to Verizon, they're always bragging about their fiber infrastructure, and AT&T to a lesser extent. So I think this tie-up satisfies two things. It gives them, a great fiber footprint, and it gives them that, that edge capability that they will need with respect to enterprise. So any other insights on your part there?
No, I saw the announcement. I thought it was a good announcement for T-Mobile.
Yeah.
I think it definitely kind of helps them build up their business use cases and improve their IoT capabilities, which I think they pretty much inherited from Sprint. So I think making it more robust and working with a known partner like Lumen is a good big step.
Yep, I agree. Well, let's move to your second topic this week, and we're going to talk about Qualcomm again. And they announced earnings, and they were pretty spectacular.
Yeah, so Qualcomm announced earnings, and they pretty much crushed everything in terms of earnings. They had a really good quarter compared to last year. So to be fair, Q2 was kind of the worst possible quarter.
Yeah.
Like they were their earnings specifically were $1.90 per share, compared to $1.67 expected, and they got $7.93 billion in revenue, over 7.62. So they crushed on both, and like I think when I was looking at the numbers, it was like they were up like 200% on profitability compared to last year, and just outlook is positive. They raised their guidance on shipments
for the following quarter.
Yeah, so they actually increased their expectations for the full calendar year to 450 to 550 million devices, and that they also increased the amount of 5G licensees to 130 from 120, and they now have it's not necessarily a 5G story, but they said that they now have a $9 billion automotive pipeline, which is bigger than most other chip companies.
Yeah.
Entirely. So they have quite a bit going on. They have all different types of businesses. That they have an IoT business, they have a home networking business, but really the focus for Qualcomm is 5G and 5G handsets. And they're kind of firing on all cylinders, and they're gonna for the foreseeable future continue to move forward with their market position, which they're mostly focusing on the high end, from what it seems like I heard during the call.
Right, and which is where the profitability is there as well. So and margin. Now you want to talk about some licensing agreements as well, right?
Yeah, that was the 130 licensing agreements that they had signed. They added 10 more, so now they're up to 130, which is quite a few. But overall, they're kind of just firing on all cylinders compared to about a year ago when things were a bit rough for them.
Yeah, and it was, the market was soft for obvious reasons, but they continue to roll, and they're truly they're one of the leaders driving the entire 5G ecosystem.
And this was the last call that their current CEO, Steve Mollenkopf, had after working the company for 26 years. So this was kind of like the handoff from him to Cristiano Amon, who's the new incoming CEO, who was previously president of the majority of the company already. So he's been the CEO in waiting for the last few quarters as they announced the transition.
Yeah, so great timing for Mr. Amon as he officially takes the reins. So let's move to my third and final topic this week. And OneWeb is finally getting off the ground, no pun intended. I've spoken about OneWeb in the past. They were really leading the LEO, the low Earth orbit satellite space race. They had some tough times. They had to declare bankruptcy just to reorganize. Hughes took an interest in them for obvious reasons. And so this week, they announced the launch of some additional satellites, which brings the total number to 182 in orbit. They say they're on schedule to cover 50 degrees of latitude above by June, with service readiness to start by the end of the year. So, can they, even though that they've, closed some major gaps here, I mean, can they compete with SpaceX and Starlink in this race to help bridge the digital divide? And, I guess my one concern is, man, there are going to be a lot of, satellites floating up there in low orbit. And there are folks that are expressing some concerns about that. But I do believe that satellite is going to be a critical element of building out a plan that will scale to support the unconnected in rural parts, all around the world. So I was pleased to see OneWeb, make some progress this week, and I think it's a good thing. I'll report anecdotally as well. So I spent some time with the Tractor Supply Company, and they're sort of like the Walmart of rural America. They have nearly 2,000 locations, and they happen to be placed in these areas that are underserved. And they've been doing fantastic things with creating mesh networks in their parking lots to allow people in these rural areas in the U.S. to be able to come in and do telemedicine services, related to COVID and other things, and distance learning, that sort of thing. And I actually spoke recently with their chief technology officer, and they're actually they've got a demo piece of equipment from SpaceX in one of their remote locations, and they're seeing phenomenal download speeds. And so, satellite's going to take a while for it to mature and progress and really, provide the level of performance. But, it's sort of like, if you're on a desert island and you haven't had a drink of water, in a year, and you're rescued, anything's going to satisfy that quench, right? And so it was cool to get a little bit of anecdotal, side information from my friends at Tractor Supply Company. But I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts about all of this?
I think it's important for Starlink to have some kind of competition.
Yeah.
Because if they get too big and too dominant, they won't necessarily be very friendly on price if they don't have to be.
Right.
I find that this is kind of the story for a lot of people who have satellite service. Prior to what was available with Starlink, all you had was basically HughesNet, and you were capped at, say, 50 gigs per second, 50 gigs a month,
Right.
and 20 or 30 megs per second.
Yeah.
And I don't know what Hughes plans to do with OneWeb, but I hope that they use OneWeb to bolster their network and potentially offer a more competitive and performance offering to what SpaceX is offering through Starlink. Right. And hopefully we'll actually get some competition in this space, because I think it's sorely needed.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will be a spark for maybe other companies to join the space, or for just more competition in general. But my biggest concern is also that there might be too many low Earth orbit satellites that might make it really hard for people to do stargazing, amongst other things. So we'll see what happens with all that. But I think it's a net positive, especially since OneWeb had been kind of sitting in mothball for a bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you spoke to the performance of HughesNet. Anecdotally, what I'm hearing is up to 10 times the performance of what you just quoted. So, your mileage may vary, but potentially, it's a game changer. So we'll definitely keep our eyes and ears open here. Let's hit your third and final topic this week, and you want to talk about a new 6G consortium that's been formed.
Yeah, so the NSF has created a new 6G consortium, made up of Apple, Ericsson, Google, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, Nokia, Qualcomm, and VMware, as well as the NIST. And basically, they created this thing called RINGS, which is what is this partnership. It's called the Resilient and Intelligent Next Generation Systems Public
Sounds
Partnership.
fancy, like something out of like Project Blue Book back in the 70s or something.
I mean, one of the number one jobs for these organizations is to think of clever names for their projects. But what's interesting about it is they are involving the industry early as opposed to late, like they did with 5G. They're also going to have $40 million in funding set aside for academic research into 6G. And they're already announcing that they're taking proposals right now. So I think this is an overall very positive thing, because I think the government is being more proactive about future technologies and involving the companies in the industry that are driving the technology already. So I think it's actually a very positive thing. And instead of having everybody trying to work separately and in a silo, I think it's better for us to have a bit more of a collaborative approach. I would have liked to have seen somebody from the 3GPP being involved, but to be fair, most of the companies that are involved are also members of the 3GPP. But this is mostly focused on the US. But as these next G standards are focused globally, hopefully this will be a group that will take into account and plan ahead just to have some kind of technological advantage in the US, just because the leading companies are working together. And that alone, I think, is a big part of this push.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to see in that list of companies a test and measurement company like a Spirent or an NI or a Keysight Technologies, because that's also they play a very critical role in helping design and test these networks. But I'm sure that'll coalesce over time. I will make a plug for my alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin. They are very heavily focused on 6G research, and I expect they will probably be submitting proposals, here as well. But I had the opportunity about a year ago to spend time with an organization that's on the University of Texas campus. They were very, involved in, massive MIMO and 5G, and they're definitely focused on 6G. So hook 'em horns. I'll be interested to watch, the next steps here. But my friend, another great week, another great podcast. We've been doing this a year. We should throw ourselves a little celebration after we're done, but why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to reach out to us to provide insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune again next week.